When your parents measure your worth in coin, you learn that even blood has a price. That's the truth Elaria Wyncrest discovers the night they sold her. The day her father signs the contract is the day she realizes fairy tales lied about families. She'd grown up believing in the stories, the ones where parents sacrificed everything for their children, where love meant protection, where a daughter's value wasn't written on a ledger beside gambling debts and unpaid loans. She'd spent years trying to be good enough, quiet enough, useful enough, taking her medicine without complaint, learning embroidery her trembling hands could barely manage, forcing smiles through the whispers that she was too frail, too weak, too worthless to attract a proper husband. But hope, she learned, was the cruelest currency of all, because when it's finally crushed, you don't just feel the pain of your circumstances. You feel the ache of every moment you dared to believe you mattered. Dear friends, before the carriage arrives and her fate is sealed, tell me in the comments from what corner of the world you're watching. I'd love to know where this story finds you. Also, subscribe to the channel to support us, and follow each chapter as Elaria's journey unfolds of betrayal, curses, and a love powerful enough to break them both. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The candlelight flickered across her mother's face as Lady Portia Wyncrest wept tears that glittered like diamonds, rehearsed and perfect. Elaria stood in the shadows of their crumbling drawing room, watching her father's hand shake as he dipped the quill in ink. "It's for the family," her mother whispered, dabbing at her eyes with lace that cost more than Elaria's medical care for a year. "You understand, don't you, darling? A daughter's duty is to be useful." Her father's voice cut through the room like a blade, cold and final. Lord Hadrian Wyncrest didn't look at Elaria as he signed her name beneath his own. "Which you have never been." The contract crackled as he rolled it, sealing it with the Wyncrest sigil, the same crest Elaria had once worn with pride, believing it meant she belonged to something. "The debt is cleared," the document read, "in exchange for one female, age 22, to enter the service and possession of His Grace, Duke Calum Ravenshade, under terms of permanent indenture." Possession, not employment, not service. Possession. "The Duke's representative will arrive within the hour," her father announced, already pouring himself brandy, the expensive kind he'd sworn they couldn't afford. "Have her ready." Her mother fussed with Elaria's hair, straightening the threadbare ribbon at her collar as if appearance mattered now. "You should be grateful," she murmured, her perfume cloying and sweet. "Girls like you don't often get such opportunities. The Duke is wealthy beyond measure. You'll want for nothing, except freedom," Elaria thought, but didn't say. She'd learned years ago that her voice held no weight in this house. Through the window, she could see the village torches flickering in the darkness. She'd heard the stories about Duke Ravenshade everyone had, how women entered his estate and never left, how mirrors in his manor were covered in black silk, how even the king spoke his name with caution. They called him cursed, dangerous, a collector of broken things. And now, Elaria realized with cold clarity, she was about to become part of his collection. The sound of hoofbeats echoed through the night, slow, deliberate, inevitable. Her mother's hands stilled in her hair. Her father's glass paused halfway to his lips. The carriage that appeared in their courtyard was black as midnight, drawn by silver-maned stallions whose breath misted in the cold air. No crest marked its doors, no driver sat at the reins. It simply waited. "Go on then," her father said, not meeting her eyes. "Don't keep His Grace waiting." Elaria looked at her parents one last time, her mother's tears already drying, her father already counting the coins her life had bought him. In that moment, she understood. She had never been their daughter. She had always been their debt. She walked to the carriage alone, her thin shoes crunching on gravel, her breath forming small clouds in the autumn air. The door opened by itself, revealing velvet seats and darkness beyond. Behind her, she heard her mother's voice, bright and relieved. "Well, that's settled then." Elaria climbed inside. The door closed with a soft, final click, and as the carriage began to move, carrying her toward a future she couldn't imagine and a man she'd never met, She caught her reflection in the carriage window, pale, fragile, worthless. At least, she thought as the only home she'd ever known disappeared into the darkness, he paid more for me than they ever thought I was worth. The horse's hooves beat a rhythm against the road. Useless, useless, useless. And Elaria, the girl who'd spent her whole life trying to prove otherwise, finally stopped trying. But to understand how Elaria became the girl her parents could sell like livestock, you need to know what her life was like before that night, before she learned that love was just another word for leverage. There was a time when the Wyncrest name meant something. Elaria could still remember it barely. She'd been 6 years old when they'd hosted the summer ball, back when their estate gleamed with polished silver and fresh flowers, when her mother's laugh wasn't edged with desperation, when her father smiled without the sour smell of brandy on his breath. She remembered dancing in the gardens, her tiny feet stumbling over silk slippers too fine for a child, while nobles praised her parents' hospitality and her mother collected compliments like precious gems. Such a lovely daughter, they'd said. What a blessing. Back then, Elaria had believed them. The sickness came, that autumn, slow at first, then consuming. Fevers that left her weak for weeks. Dizzy spells that sent her tumbling downstairs. A persistent exhaustion that physicians couldn't explain and expensive tonics couldn't cure. Growing pains, the first doctor had declared, pocketing his fee. Weak constitution, said the second, recommending bed rest and broth. Feminine delicacy, whispered the third, implying it was simply her nature to be frail. But Elaria knew the truth. They wouldn't speak. She was expensive. Every doctor visit, every medicine, every day she spent in bed instead of learning the accomplishments that might attract a wealthy husband, all of it cost money her family increasingly didn't have. She tried so hard to be worth the expense. At 8, she forced herself to learn piano despite hands that trembled. At 10, she mastered embroidery even though the close work made her head pound. At 12, she studied etiquette until she could curtsy without swaying, could smile through pain, could make herself small and pleasant and useful. None of it mattered. Another bad investment, she'd overheard her father tell her mother one night when they thought she was sleeping. 20 gold sovereigns to that quack physician, and she's still pale as a ghost. No man wants a wife who'll die birthing his first heir. Her mother's reply had been softer, but no kinder. Perhaps we should have stopped trying years ago. Elaria had pressed her face into her pillow that night, learning the hardest lesson of her young life. Love wasn't what parents felt for children who cost too much. The family's descent accelerated when she turned 16. Her father, desperate to restore their fortune, had taken up gambling. Just until we recoup our losses, he'd promised, kissing her mother's hand like a gentleman from those fairy tales Elaria had loved. One good hand, one good investment, and we'll be back on top. One good hand became 100 bad ones. The estate began to empty. First the artwork, sold to private collectors. Then the horses, the carriages, the silver tea service that had been in the Wyncrest family for 4 generations. Her mother's jewelry vanished, piece by piece, though Lady Portia claimed she'd simply stored it somewhere safe. The servants left some dismissed, others fleeing before wages stopped entirely. By the time Elaria turned 20, they were living in 6 rooms of a 40-room manor, eating yesterday's bread and calling it fashionably frugal. Her mother's friends stopped calling, invitations stopped arriving. The Wyncrest name, once spoken with respect, became whispered with pity. And through it all, Elaria tried to help. She took over the household management, stretching every copper penny. She mended their clothes by candlelight, saving the cost of a seamstress. She tended the kitchen garden herself, dirt under her fingernails and sun on her face, growing vegetables they could no longer afford to buy. At least make yourself useful, her mother would say, not looking up from her fashion papers she still subscribed to despite everything, as if reading about silk gowns could conjure them into existence. Useful, that word became Elaria's entire existence. She tried to be useful when her father stumbled home drunk at dawn, helping him to bed before the neighbors saw. Useful when her mother raged about their circumstances, absorbing the anger like a sponge. Useful when creditors came to the door, lying with a practiced smile. Father is away, on business. I'll be sure to relay your message. But there was one way she could never be useful, and everyone knew it. The Hartwell girl married a baron, her mother announced one morning, her voice sharp as breaking glass. She slammed the society page on the breakfast table, their last newspaper subscription, the one luxury she refused to abandon. 15,000 a year. And her father was a merchant. A merchant, Elaria. And what do we have? A daughter who can't even stand through a ball without needing to sit down. Elaria stared at her porridge, saying nothing. What was there to say? The Pemberton boy is looking for a wife. Her mother had tried a year ago, arranging a meeting with barely concealed desperation. Elaria had dressed in her finest gown, a dress 3 years out of fashion, let out twice to hide how thin she'd become. She'd styled her hair the way the magazines suggested. She'd smiled until her face ached. The Pemberton boy had taken one look at her pale complexion and trembling hands, had stayed for exactly 15 minutes of painful conversation, and had never called again. Too sickly, she'd overheard his mother tell a friend at church. Imagine wasting a dowry on a girl who might not survive childbirth. The Wyncrests must be desperate indeed. Her mother had wept for 3 days. Not for Elaria's humiliation, but for the lost opportunity. More suitors followed. Each one left faster than the last. Her reputation spread. Wyncrest's sickly daughter. Pretty enough, but what's the point? Probably barren. Definitely expensive. By 21, the matchmakers stopped calling. By 22, even her mother stopped trying. Perhaps, Lady Portia had said one evening, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd finally accepted defeat, we should consider alternative arrangements. Elaria had known what that meant. Companion to an elderly widow, governess to some merchant family's children. Anything that might at least feed her, remove the burden of her existence from the family ledger. She'd agreed without argument. Anything was better than watching her parents' resentment calcify into hatred. What she hadn't known, what she couldn't have imagined, was that her father's debts had grown so vast that even selling her into service wouldn't have covered them. The Duke's offer came on a Tuesday. Elaria had been in the garden, pulling weeds from soil too poor to grow much of anything anymore, when she'd heard her father's study door slam open. 30,000 sovereigns! His voice had boomed through the manor, louder than she'd heard it in months. 30,000! In gold! Portia, we're saved! Elaria had brushed the dirt from her hands, confused. They had nothing left to sell. No property, no investments, no assets worth a fraction of that amount. Later that evening, she'd understood. A duke has made an offer for you, her mother had said, sitting Elaria down in the drawing room like this was a normal proposal, like this was cause for celebration. Duke Ravenshade, one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. For marriage? Elaria had asked, confused. Noblemen didn't marry girls like her. They married heiresses, daughters of powerful families, women who brought alliances and fortunes. Her mother's smile had been strange, tight. For companionship, he requires someone to manage his household, attend to his needs. It's a great honor. It's a contract, her father had corrected, unrolling the document. 7 years of service in exchange for clearing all Wyncrest debts. Room and board provided. A generous arrangement. 7 years. The words had echoed in Elaria's mind. 7 years away from the only home she'd ever known, serving a man she'd never met, whose reputation made even her father, who feared nothing after losing everything, shift uncomfortably. You'll accept, of course, her mother had said. It wasn't a question. Elaria had looked at her parents, really looked at them. Her father's eyes, unable to meet hers. Her mother's hands, twisted together in her lap. The fine tremor in both their voices that betrayed not hope, but relief. Relief that she was finally worth something. Relief that the burden of her was ending. Of course, Elaria had whispered, because what else could she say? That had been 3 days ago. Now, in the darkness of the Duke's carriage, rattling toward an unknown future, Elaria finally allowed herself to feel everything she'd been holding back. The anger, the grief, the bitter, choking realization that she had spent her entire life trying to earn love that had never truly existed. Her parents hadn't sold her because they were desperate. They'd sold her because she'd finally become useful. The horse's hooves continued their rhythm against the cobblestones, steady and relentless, carrying her toward Ravenshade Manor and the mysterious Duke who'd paid 30,000 sovereigns for a girl her own parents called worthless. Elaria closed her eyes and made herself a promise. Whatever happened in that cursed manor, whoever the Duke turned out to be, she would survive. Not for her parents, not to prove her worth, but because surviving was the only revenge left to the powerless. And maybe, just maybe, the girl they'd called useless would finally discover what she was truly capable of. The journey to Ravenshade Manor took 3 days. By the time the carriage finally stopped, Elaria had learned to sleep sitting up, had memorized every crack in the velvet ceiling, and had convinced herself she was ready for whatever awaited her. She was wrong. Chapter 2. The carriage stopped so abruptly that Elaria jolted forward, her hands catching against the velvet seats. For 3 days, the rhythmic sway of travel had been her entire world. Now, in the sudden stillness, her heart hammered against her ribs. The door opened. Ravenshade Manor rose before her, like a monument to grief, a massive stone fortress that seemed to drink in the twilight rather than reflect it. Towers stretched toward a sky heavy with clouds, their windows dark and watchful. Ivy crawled up the walls like veins, and the whole estate was wrapped in a silence so complete that even the wind seemed afraid to make noise. Asterisk. This is where women disappear, asterisk, Elaria thought, her throat tight. Miss Wyncrest. A woman stood at the entrance, her black dress severe against the gray stone, her face carved from duty and wariness. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled into a merciless bun, and eyes that assessed Elaria like she was measuring her for a coffin. I am Mrs. Stovane, the housekeeper. You'll follow me. No welcome, no warmth, just expectation. Elaria climbed the steps on unsteady legs, her thin traveling cloak offering no protection against the chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones. As she crossed the threshold, she noticed it immediately something profoundly wrong with the entrance hall. Every mirror was covered. Black silk draped over ornate frames, turning what should have been sources of light into void dark rectangles that lined the walls like windows into nothing. The effect was suffocating, as though the house itself refused to look at its own reflection. Your quarters are in the east wing, Mrs. Stovane said, her footsteps echoing through corridors lined with more shrouded mirrors. You're to keep to your assigned rooms. The library, the dining room, and the morning parlor are available to you. Everywhere else, her voice hardened, is forbidden. Everywhere? Elaria's voice came out smaller than she intended. Asterisk, especially times the west wing. Mrs. Stovane stopped, turning to fix Elaria with a stare that felt like a physical warning. Girls who wander where they don't belong tend to, well, let's say His Grace values obedience above all else. They passed 3 servants on the stairs, each one dropping their gaze the moment they saw Elaria, scurrying past like rabbits fleeing a hawk. Their fear was palpable, infectious. His Grace will see you in the dining room at 8, Mrs. Stovane continued, depositing Elaria in a bedroom that was far too beautiful for a servant. Silk curtains, a 4-poster bed, a writing desk by the window. Dress appropriately. Speak only when spoken to. And remember, she paused at the door. You're here to provide Times company asterisk. Nothing more. Don't mistake his loneliness for kindness. Then she was gone, the door clicking shut with a finality that made Elaria's stomach clench. At 8 o'clock precisely, Elaria entered the dining room and saw him for the first time. Asterisk asterisk Duke Calum Ravenshade asterisk asterisk stood by the window, his back to her, his silhouette sharp against the dying light. He was tall, far taller than she'd expected, his frame lean but powerful, dressed entirely in black that made him look like a piece of the darkness itself given form. When he turned, Elaria forgot how to breathe. His face was beautiful in the way winter was. Beautiful, cold, remote, perfect. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, dark hair that fell just past his collar. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. Silver, like mercury, like moonlight on steel, holding a weariness that seemed older than his years. Sit. His voice was low, controlled, carrying both command and a bone-deep exhaustion that made her chest ache unexpectedly. She sat. "You're here to keep me company," he said, not quite looking at her. "You'll read to me in the evenings. Dine with me when I require it. Speak when spoken to. That's all." A pause. "Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Good." He moved to his chair with a measured grace that seemed rehearsed, as if he'd learned long ago not to make sudden movements. "The contract is 7 years. Survive them, and you'll be compensated well enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Asterisk. Survive. Asterisk. Such a strange word choice. Throughout dinner, she watched him from beneath her lashes, the way his hands remained steady despite the shadows in his eyes, the way he spoke with careful politeness that held everyone at arm's length. There was grief in him, she realized, an ocean of it, carefully contained behind walls of aristocratic control. Something in her recognized it, fellow survivors of different shipwrecks perhaps. That night, alone in her too beautiful room, Elaria couldn't sleep. Whispers drifted through the corridors, soft, feminine, unintelligible. She told herself it was wind, old houses, nothing more. But then she saw it. In the covered mirror beside her wardrobe, beneath the black silk, something moved. A silhouette flickered the outline of a woman, her hands pressed against the glass, as if trying to escape. Elaria's breath caught. The shape shifted, became clearer. A face emerged from the darkness, young, terrified, mouth open in a silent scream. It wasn't Elaria's reflection. The woman in the mirror was someone else entirely. Chapter 3. By the third dinner, Elaria had learned the shape of the Duke's silences. Some were comfortable, the quiet of shared space, of two people who didn't need words to fill every moment. Others were heavy, weighted with things he wouldn't say, memories that pressed against his carefully maintained composure like water against a dam. "Your family," Calum said one evening, his silver eyes fixed on the wine in his glass, rather than her face. "Tell me about them." Elaria's fingers tightened on her fork. "There's little to tell, Your Grace. They sold you for 30,000 sovereigns. His voice was soft, but something sharp edged beneath it. "There's always a story in that kind of desperation, or that kind of relief," she said before she could stop herself. His gaze lifted then, meeting hers, and she saw something flicker in those mercury eyes, recognition, perhaps understanding. "You speak of family as transaction. That takes a particular kind of pain." She said nothing, but felt the truth of his words settle in her chest like stones. "Gentleness," he said after a moment, "is a rare courage. Most people mistake it for weakness." He set down his glass. "I suspect you've learned the difference." Elaria didn't know how to respond to kindness that saw through her so clearly, so she simply nodded. And something in the air between them shifted, a fragile thread of connection neither of them dared acknowledge aloud. The library became her refuge. It was vast, 3 stories of books that climbed toward a painted ceiling, where angels watched with knowing eyes. Elaria spent her afternoons there, grateful for the solitude, running her fingers along leather spines, while dust motes danced in shafts of pale light. That's where she found the portraits. They hung in an alcove she'd almost missed, 7 paintings of women, each one beautiful, each one young. The brass plaques beneath bore names and dates. Isadora Trent, 1809. Cecilia Ashford, 1812. Margot Bellamy, 1815. All previous companions, all deceased within a year of arrival. Elaria's blood ran cold as she counted them. 7 women, 7 deaths. And she was meant to be the 8th. "What are you doing here, Calum?" she wondered, staring at faces frozen in oil and time. "What kills the women who keep you company?" The whispers grew worse each night. They weren't random anymore, they had rhythm, cadence, almost like language, just beyond comprehension. Elaria would wake at midnight, at 2, at 4, hearing feminine voices drift through walls, as if the house itself were haunted by ghosts who'd forgotten how to rest. On the 7th night, she couldn't bear it anymore. She approached the covered mirror in her room, her heart hammering. "Don't!" some rational part of her mind warned, but her hands were already lifting the silk, peeling it back just enough to see, and there they were. Not one face, but dozens. Women pressed against the glass from the other side, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror and pleading. They reached toward her, their hands flattening against an invisible barrier, and Elaria realized with dawning horror that she could feel their emotions: despair like drowning, rage like fire, sorrow so deep it had weight. They were trapped, imprisoned, suffering. "Please," she heard felt from somewhere beyond sound. "Help us. Don't let him." The silk was ripped from her hands. Caleb stood in her doorway, his face transformed by fury so absolute it made him unrecognizable. "What did I tell you?" His voice was thunder, barely controlled violence that shook the air between them. "What did Mrs. Devane tell you? Don't touch the mirrors. There are women," Elaria gasped, stumbling back. "Trapped. They're trapped. I can see them." "You see nothing." He tore through her room, checking every covered mirror, ensuring the silk was secure. "You understand nothing. These mirrors stay covered. These halls stay forbidden. And you," he rounded on her, and she saw it then beneath the rage. Terror. Raw, desperate terror. "You will obey, or you will end up just like them. Like the 7 before me?" The words escaped before fear could stop them. "The companions, who all died here?" Something in him broke. The fury drained from his face, leaving only exhaustion and grief so profound it made her chest ache. "Get out," he whispered. "Get out of this room. Sleep somewhere else tonight. Your Grace. Please." The words sounded like it cost him everything. "Just go." Elaria spent that night in the library, curled in a window seat, watching dawn break over the cursed estate. And slowly, pieces began fitting together: the sickness that had plagued her childhood, the dizzy spells, the way she'd always sensed emotions in rooms before anyone spoke them, the shimmer she'd see around angry people, the heaviness that preceded tears, the way she'd known her parents' love was dying long before they'd said the words. Her parents had called her frail, weak, sensitive. They'd been wrong. She wasn't broken, she was attuned to feelings, to energies, to things that existed just beyond the visible world. The women in the mirrors weren't hallucinations. They were real, and somehow, impossibly, Elaria could perceive them when no one else could. "Maybe," she thought as morning light touched her face, "maybe I was never useless. Maybe I was just surrounded by people who couldn't see what I was worth." Chapter 4. The storm came on the 10th night, violent and sudden, as if the sky itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled in fury. Thunder shook the manor's foundations. Lightning carved the darkness into fragments of white and shadow. And somewhere in the depths of Ravenshade, Elaria heard music. She followed it through corridors she'd been warned away from, her candle guttering with each gust from windows that rattled in their frames. The melody was haunting, melancholic, a piano played by someone who'd long ago forgotten how to feel joy. The music room's door stood open. Caleb sat at a grand piano, his jacket discarded, his white shirt open at the collar, a crystal decanter of amber liquid at his elbow. His fingers moved across the keys with muscle memory alone, because his eyes, those silver eyes, stared at nothing, seeing something far beyond this room, this night, this life. He was drunk, beautifully, devastatingly drunk. "You shouldn't be here," he said without looking up, without stopping the music. His words slurred just enough to betray him. "Neither should you, I think." Elaria stepped inside, setting her candle on a side table. "Not alone. Not like this." His hands crashed down on the keys in discord. What do you know about being alone? He reached for the decanter, poured with shaking hands. You've been here 10 days. 10 days. And you think you understand. I understand that 7 women came before me and died. She kept her voice steady. I understand that you're terrified I'll be the 8th. The glass stopped halfway to his lips. Tell me, Elaria said quietly, moving closer. Tell me what's killing them. Because I saw them, Your Grace. In the mirrors. They're not at rest. For a long moment, only the storm answered. Then Calum laughed a broken, terrible sound. My mother, he said, the words tasting like poison, was beautiful. The kind of beauty that men wrote sonnets about, that kingdoms went to war over, and she was terrified of losing it. He drained the glass in one swallow. When age began touching her face, she turned to darker arts, blood magic, soul binding. She found a way to trap beauty in mirrors, to steal youth from reflections and wear it like a gown. His voice dropped to something raw. But magic always demands payment. The spell required an anchor, someone whose suffering would sustain it eternally. You, Elaria breathed, her only son. Bitterness dripped from every syllable. She cursed me on my 21st birthday, said it was a gift, that I would live forever, surrounded by beauty, that women would flock to me, that I'd never be alone. He stood abruptly, unsteady, grief and rage warring in his expression. What she didn't tell me was that any woman who stays here, any woman who begins to care for me, feeds the curse. The mirrors steal them, trap their souls, and each death makes the enchantment stronger. Lightning illuminated his face, the anguish carved into every line, the self-loathing that had become his constant companion. 7 women, his voice cracked. 7 women who were kind to me, who smiled at me, who made this cursed house feel less like a tomb, and I killed them all just by letting them stay. You didn't kill them, Elaria said. Your mother did. She's dead. The words exploded from him. Dead for 15 years, and the curse remains. I've brought in priests, witches, scholars. No one can break it. So I stopped trying. I stopped bringing companions here, stopped risking lives. He turned to her, eyes blazing with anguish and alcohol, until the debts came due and I needed. I thought if I kept you distant, if I remained cold, if you never cared, but I already do. The confession hung between them like something fragile and terrifying. Calum's expression shifted, horror replacing rage. Then you're already dying? He whispered. The moment affection blooms, the mirrors begin feeding. You have weeks, perhaps a month, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. Elaria should have been afraid, should have run. Instead, she felt only sorrow for this man who'd been turned into a weapon against anyone who dared offer him gentleness. Then we find a way, she said simply. There is no way. There's always a way. She met his gaze steadily. Your mother found magic to create this curse. Someone, somewhere, knows magic to break it. That night, while Calum slept off his confession in the music room, Elaria returned to the library. She found the grimoires, tucked behind a false panel, ancient texts bound in leather and secrets, pages brittle with age. She read by candlelight until dawn, her childhood sensitivity, helping her perceive which passages held truth and which were merely superstition. And as she traced descriptions of soul binding and blood curses, something else began taking root in her chest, something dangerous and inevitable. She was falling for him, for his pain, his isolation, his desperate attempt to protect her, even as he crumbled. Foolish, she told herself. But her heart had never listened to reason. Chapter 5. Come. The whisper woke Elaria just past midnight, feminine and urgent, pulling at something deep in her chest. Come, before it's too late. She rose from bed as if compelled, her feet carrying her through dark corridors without conscious thought. The air grew colder with each step, her breath misting, and she somehow knew she was being led to the west wing, the forbidden halls. The doorway stood open, waiting. Beyond it stretched a corridor lined with mirrors, each one draped in black silk that rippled like water despite the absence of wind. The whispers grew louder here, overlapping, desperate. Please, help us. Free us. Hurry. At the corridor's end, double doors loomed ornate, ancient, sealed with wax that bore the Ravenshade crest. They swung open at her touch. The hall of mirrors stretched before her like a cathedral built to worship vanity. Dozens of gilded frames lined the walls, floor to ceiling, each one covered in black fabric that seemed to pulse with trapped energy. The air itself felt thick, heavy with suffering. Elaria's hands trembled as she reached for the nearest drape. "Don't," a voice whispered from within the glass, not threatening, pleading. She pulled the silk away. Light exploded behind the mirror's surface, not reflection, but presence. Faces emerged from the depths, pressing against an invisible barrier. The 7 companions she'd seen in portraits, and dozens more women spanning generations, their expressions frozen in eternal anguish. And at the center, commanding, even in imprisonment, a woman whose beauty was terrible and cold. "Duchess Ravenshade," Elaria breathed. The woman's reflection smiled, sharp as broken glass. "The architect of her own prison," she said, her voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "And my son's eternal torment. How fitting that you would be the one to find us." "You did this," fury heeded Elaria's words. "You cursed your own child." "I cursed myself." The Duchess's expression flickered with something that might have been regret. "I thought I could control it, harvest beauty without consequence. But magic is a hungry thing, girl. It consumed me first, then every woman who dared love my son thereafter. Then tell me how to break it." "You already know." The Duchess's eyes, silver like Calem's, fixed on her with unsettling intensity. "Love will undo us all, but not the possessive kind that built this curse. Only love that asks for nothing, that gives without expectation of return, can shatter what selfishness created. An unselfish heart." Another voice joined in, Isadora, the first companion. "We loved him wanting safety, security, escape. Our love was transaction. But yours." The Duchess studied Elaria with something like wonder. "Yours is different. You love him knowing it will destroy you. That's the key we could never turn." "Elaria!" Calem's roar shook the hall. He appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of terror and rage, and suddenly he was there, grabbing her shoulders, pulling her away from the mirrors. "What have you done?" His voice cracked. "What have you done? The curse will take you now. Tonight I told you to stay away." "I had to know." She pushed against his chest, refusing to be moved. "I had to understand." "Understanding won't save you." He was shaking, this powerful duke, reduced to desperate fear. "Leave. Leave this manor. Leave this county. Go somewhere the curse can't follow." "No." The word rang through the hall like a bell. "You're terrified because you think love makes me weak," Elaria said, her voice steady even as tears burned her eyes. "You call me useless because you cannot imagine love that asks for nothing in return. But I see you, Calem. Not the curse, not the title, not the fear you, and I choose to stay. You'll die. Then I'll die choosing. Not sold, not traded, not thrown away choosing." The mirrors began to hum. Light fractured behind the glass, sharp, brilliant, painful. The covered drapes burst into flames that burned cold and white. Calem pulled Elaria back as the first mirror shattered, then the second, then all of them at once, in a cascading symphony of destruction. Glass rained down like deadly snow. Energy surged through the hall, the accumulated suffering of centuries releasing all at once. Calem threw himself over Elaria as shards sliced through his jacket, his arms protecting her even as the curse he'd been imprisoned by finally began to break. Elaria felt her strength draining, her vision dimming. The curse was feeding one last time, consuming her light to fuel its own destruction. As consciousness slipped away, she reached up to touch Calem's face, bloodied, terrified, beautiful. "I am not afraid of you," she whispered. Then darkness took her, and she knew nothing more. Chapter 6. Elaria woke to the sound of the world ending. She was in her room, locked in, she realized, rattling the door handle uselessly. Beyond it, the manor screamed. Glass shattered in distant rooms, like 1,000 bells breaking. The walls trembled. Spectral light leaked through the crack beneath her door, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. Calum had locked her away. No. She threw herself against the door, her weakened body protesting. No. You don't get to face this alone. The manor groaned, and through her gift, that sensitivity she'd once thought a curse, she felt it. Souls awakening, the trapped women rising like a tide, the curse consuming itself in one final, catastrophic feast. And Calum, alone in the center of it all, preparing to offer himself as the last sacrifice. Elaria closed her eyes, reached for the door handle, and felt for the lock's mechanism. Her gift had always shown her emotions, but metal had memory too. She sensed the tumbler's shape, the way it wanted to move, and with trembling focus, she heard the click. The door swung open. The Hall of Mirrors was no longer a hall, it was a storm made visible. Shattered glass hung, suspended in air, rotating slowly, catching light that had no source. The trapped souls manifested as ribbons of silver and shadow, swirling around Calum like a cyclone. He stood at the center, his arms outstretched, his face tilted upward in acceptance. "Take me instead," he was saying, his voice echoing with power and resignation. "Release them. End this. I am the anchor, destroy the anchor, and the curse dies with me." "That's not how this works." Elaria's voice cut through the chaos. Calum spun, horror flooding his features. "Elaria, no. You think martyrdom will break a curse built on selfishness?" She stepped into the maelstrom, glass shards parting around her like water. "You think more sacrifice, more death, will somehow balance the scales?" The souls began keening a sound like wind through broken churches. "Your mother took without giving," Elaria continued, walking toward him even as the supernatural storm intensified. "She possessed, controlled, consumed. You can't fight possession with more possession, Calum, not even of yourself." She reached him, took his bloodied hands in hers. "We end this together, not through death, through release." The curse surged, sensing opportunity, reaching for them both with hungry tendrils of light and shadow. Elaria turned to face the heart of it, the fractured mirrors that still held power, the Duchess's reflection watching with those calculating silver eyes. "You gave me a price," Elaria said clearly, addressing the curse itself, the magic that had fed on transaction for so long. "But I was never a possession. I choose this. I choose him. I choose to give freely what cannot be bought." She released Calum's hands and stepped forward, opening her arms to the storm. "Take what I offer, not as payment, not as debt, but as gift." Her spirit, her light, her essence, everything that made her her, began to lift from her body, merging with the trapped souls. She felt them, their pain, their stories, their desperate yearning for freedom, and she felt the curse beginning to transform, confused by love that demanded nothing in return. "Elaria!" Calum's anguished cry tore through the hall. He lunged after her, plunging his hands into the spectral light. "If you take her, you take me too," he said, his voice breaking. "I renounce the title that bound this curse. I renounce the blood magic that used my life as anchor. I give up everything, power, wealth, immortality for her." The curse shattered, not with violence, but with a sound like a breath released after centuries of holding it. The mirrors dissolved into mist. The trapped souls scattered like starlight, finally free. The storm collapsed inward, then exploded outward in a wave of pure, clear silence. Elaria's body crumpled to the floor. Calum caught her, dropping to his knees, cradling her against his chest. She wasn't breathing. Her skin was cold. Her eyes stared at nothing. "No." His voice fractured. "No, please, Elaria, please." He held her as the manor settled into stillness, as dawn began creeping through windows no longer shadowed by curse. He held her and wept, this man who'd been alone for so long, who'd finally learned to love, only to lose it. "Come back," he whispered against her hair. "You said you weren't afraid. So don't leave me. Please don't leave me." The first rays of sunlight touched her face, and Elaria gasped a small, fragile sound. Her chest rose, fell, rose again. Her eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on Calem's tear-stained face hovering above hers. "I told you," she breathed, her voice barely audible, but alive. Together, the curse was broken, not through death, but through two people learning that love was strongest when it asked for nothing but gave everything. Chapter 7. 6 months after the curse shattered, Ravenshade Manor bloomed. Sunlight poured through uncovered windows, illuminating rooms that had lived in shadow for generations. The black silk had been burned, every last scrap of it, and mirrors now reflected only what was real. Flowers in vases, servants who smiled instead of cowered, and two people learning what it meant to build a life on choice rather than obligation. Elaria walked through the rose gardens, with her hand tucked into the crook of Calem's arm, her pale blue dress catching the spring breeze. The gardens had been wild when she'd arrived, overgrown, thorned, dying. Now they flourished, much like everything else the curse had touched. "Lady Pemberton accepted," Calem said, his voice carrying a warmth that still surprised her some mornings. "Her daughter will be the Haven School's 15th student. The girl whose father lost everything in shipping?" Elaria smiled. "Good. She deserves better than being auctioned off to the highest bidder." The Haven School had been Ilaria's idea, a place for girls without dowries, without prospects, without families willing to invest in them. Girls who'd been called useless. Here, they learned trades, languages, estate management. They learned their worth wasn't measured in gold sovereigns or marriage prospects. Calem had funded it without hesitation, transforming the East Wing into dormitories and classrooms. "My wife's school," he called it with quiet pride, though everyone knew it was far more than that. It was revolution dressed as charity, and the nobles were too polite to object while their duke smiled his approval. "Another letter came this morning," Calem said carefully, watching her face. "From Wyncrest." Elaria's expression didn't change. "Where is it?" "The study." They found it on his desk, expensive stationery, her mother's flowery script. "Dearest Elaria, we've heard such wonderful news about your marriage. Perhaps we might visit to celebrate this joyous reunion of family." Elaria held it over the fireplace candle until the edges caught. They watched it burn together, her parents' desperate words turning to ash. "No regrets?" Calem asked softly. "None." She turned into his arms, resting her head against his chest where his heart beat steady and strong. "They had their chance to love me. They chose not to. That's not my burden to carry anymore." He pressed a kiss to her hair, this man who'd learned that love didn't have to hurt, didn't have to consume, that it could be gentle and still be powerful. The royal gathering came in late summer, an unavoidable obligation of Calem's title. Elaria wore emerald silk and the Ravenshade diamonds, looking every inch a duchess despite never having been trained for it. She'd learned that grace wasn't about bloodline, it was about how you carried yourself when the world expected you to break. Lord Ashford, wine-drunk and curious, cornered Calem by the refreshment table. "Your wife, Ravenshade. There are rumors about her origins. Something about being sold to clear family debts?" The ballroom quieted slightly, nobles pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Calem's silver eyes found Elaria across the room, where she stood speaking with a young countess, probably recruiting for the Haven School. His expression softened in a way that made several ladies sigh. "They called her useless once," he said, his voice carrying just enough for nearby eavesdroppers to hear. "I call her my salvation." Lord Ashford blinked, uncertain whether he'd been answered or dismissed. Calem smiled, the rare, genuine smile that appeared only when speaking of his wife. "The rumors are incomplete, Ashford. They forget to mention that the girl they discarded became the woman who saved not just me, but dozens of young women from the same fate. I'd say that's rather remarkable usefulness, wouldn't you?" He walked away, leaving the lord stammering into his wine. That night, back at Ravenshade, Elaria stood before her bedroom mirror, the same one that had once shown her a stranger's screaming face. Now it showed only her, flushed from dancing, smiling, alive. Calum appeared behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders, his reflection joining hers in the glass. "What are you thinking?" "That I'm not afraid anymore," she said softly. "Of mirrors, of my reflection, of being seen." "You were always worth seeing," he murmured against her temple. "The world just wasn't looking properly." She turned in his arms, standing on tiptoe to kiss him, this man who'd been cursed to destroy love and instead learned to receive it. Who'd been alone for so long and now filled his home with students and laughter and purpose. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For paying 30,000 sovereigns for a girl her own parents called worthless." She smiled against his lips. "Best investment you ever made." He laughed, a sound that would have been impossible 6 months ago, and kissed her again. Outside, the rose gardens swayed in the evening breeze. Inside, the mirrors reflected only light and life, and two people who'd learned that the greatest magic wasn't in curses or spells. It was in choosing each other, freely, every single day. The girl they'd sold became the duchess they'd never imagined, and she was done apologizing for taking up space in a world that had tried to make her small. Elaria's life reminds us that being unwanted doesn't mean being unworthy. Sometimes, the people who break us are the reason we learn how to build ourselves back stronger. She was sold as something useless, yet became proof that gentleness can be power, and love, when it's freely given, can rewrite even the darkest fate. If her story reached something in you, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and what part of Elaria's journey spoke to your heart the most. Don't forget to subscribe, and stay with us as we share more stories of strength, healing, and hope born from pain. Because maybe, like Elaria, you just need to be reminded you were never the problem. You were always the light trying to survive the darkness.